Now, let's think about this carefully. When we talk about nations, when we talk about civilization itself, we're not simply talking about power or military might or economic advantage. We're talking about identity, about pride, about the moral courage to assert oneself on the global stage. And that is precisely what we have seen in this instance. India, through the voice of its foreign minister, Dr. S. Jaishankar, delivering a message that was not only powerful, but in many ways deeply unsettling for the West, and particularly for the United States under Trump's rhetoric. What makes this moment so extraordinary is not merely the words spoken, but the principle behind them. For centuries, nations like India were expected to remain silent, to defer, to nod politely while the so-called great powers dictated the terms of engagement. But that era is changing, and Jaishankar's message, direct, confident, unapologetic, embodied that transformation. This is not just India responding to Trump. This is India stepping forward as a civilizational force, one that refuses to be patronized or dismissed, and the West, quite frankly, is shocked. Because when a nation that had historically been positioned as a follower suddenly speaks as a leader, the balance of perception shifts dramatically. So, what does this mean? It means India is no longer willing to be lectured. It means the world must now contend with an India that knows its worth, its history, and its destiny. And that is why this message, carries far more weight than a simple diplomatic exchange. It is, in essence, the declaration of a new balance of power. India refuses to be lectured by the West, and this statement captures a profound transformation in international relations. For a long time, global politics operated under a hierarchy in which certain nations, the Western powers in particular, positioned themselves as the moral arbiters of the world. They decided what was right and wrong, what was acceptable and unacceptable, and they expected others, especially developing nations, to simply comply. This system functioned not only through military and economic superiority, but also through a kind of intellectual dominance, a belief that the West alone had the authority to define values, policies, and legitimacy. But that model is breaking down, and India is at the forefront of challenging it. When Jaishankar, India's external affairs minister, asserts that India does not need lectures from the West, it is not just a defensive response to criticism. It is a declaration of independence on the ideological battlefield. India is saying, we have our own history, our own civilization, our own democratic traditions, and our own world. We will not be judged by standards that are selectively applied, nor will we be shamed into compliance with narratives that ignore the hypocrisy of those who claim superiority. This position is powerful because it exposes the double standards of the West. For instance, issues like human rights, freedom, or democracy are often weaponized against nations like India, while Western countries themselves have long records of violations, interventions, and moral compromises. Refusing to be lectured does not mean refusing dialogue. Rather, it means rejecting a one-sided relationship in which one party dictates and the other passively accepts. It is about equality. India's stance communicates that international engagement must be based on mutual respect and reciprocity. If the United States or any Western nation critiques India, then India reserves the right to critique them as well. This is what mature diplomacy looks like, the rejection of paternalism in favor of partnership. Another layer of this refusal comes from India's growing confidence as a global power. Economically, strategically, and culturally, India is no longer a peripheral player. It is a central force shaping the 21st century. That confidence enables India to push back against moralizing lectures because it recognizes that it has leverage. The West needs India as a market, as a strategic partner, as a counterbalance to China, just as much as India may need the West. In this balance of interdependence, the old power dynamic, where lectures flowed one way, becomes obsolete. On a deeper cultural level, Jaishankar's assertion taps into centuries of suppressed pride. For generations, colonial rule and Western dominance forced India into a position of deference. By stating that India will not be lectured, Jaishankar voices not just a diplomatic stance, but a civilizational memory of resilience. He channels the collective realization that India has endured, adapted, and risen despite centuries of being undermined, and now it has earned the right to speak and to be heard on its own terms. This refusal, then, is not arrogance but self-respect. It signals that India is no longer a passive subject of the global narrative, but an active author of it. And when a nation with India's history, scale, and ambition declares that it will not be lectured, the message resonates across the world. The age of Western monopoly over moral authority is drawing to a close. When Jaishankar delivered his statement, it wasn't just about defending India. It was about shifting the axis of global conversation. His words weren't casual. They were deliberate, measured, and forceful in a way that left no room for misinterpretation. By speaking with such clarity, he redefined how India positions itself in the world order. And here's the key. Power is not only about tanks, trade, or treaties. Power is also about narrative, about who sets the terms of discourse. For decades, the West has been accustomed to controlling that discourse, but in this moment, India reminded everyone that the days of unilateral narrative dominance are fading. Jaishankar's words matter because they were not an outburst or a display of raw emotion. They were an expression of strategic confidence. This is how power actually manifests, through the ability to communicate a nation's stance without hesitation, without apology. His tone was calm but unyielding, the kind of tone that unsettles those used to obedience. The West expects resistance to sound defensive, but what it heard from India was not defense at all. It was assertion. That difference is crucial. Assertion says, we don't need validation, we know our value, we will engage with you as equals. That changes the global equation because it forces the West to recognize India as a partner, not as a pupil. When Jaishankar speaks, he doesn't just represent the government of India. He represents a civilization that is thousands of years old, one that has endured colonization, exploitation, and systematic attempts at marginalization. His words channel that history into the present moment, and in doing so, they signal a broader cultural awakening. It's as though India is telling the world, we are not waiting for acknowledgement anymore. We will speak, and you will listen whether you like it or not. That's what shocks the West, because it's not used to being on the receiving end of such unapologetic clarity from nations it once considered subordinate. Redefining global power dynamics means changing not just how India is perceived, but how other nations see themselves in relation to India. Smaller nations that often feel the weight of Western moralizing can look at India's stance and find encouragement. They can see that it is possible to resist, to assert independence, and still command respect. This ripple effect makes Jaishankar's message more than just about India. It becomes a symbolic challenge to an old system of global hierarchy. And what happens when the balance shifts this way? Dialogue itself transforms. The West can no longer dictate terms from a position of assumed superiority. Every conversation must now factor in India's confidence, its demands, and its unwillingness to accept double standards. That is what redefinition looks like. It is not only India stepping up, it is the West being forced to step down from its pedestal. In the end, Jaishankar's words didn't just answer Trump or the West. They set a precedent. They carved out a new space in global diplomacy where India's voice is not supplementary but central. And once that space has been claimed, it cannot easily be taken back. This is how one powerful message can. When Donald Trump spoke, his rhetoric was loud, dramatic, and often filled with a sense of dominance that sought to put others on the defensive. He built his image on the ability to project strength, to declare superiority, and to force nations into reacting to his words. Yet when that rhetoric collided with India's unapologetic confidence, something remarkable happened. It lost its intimidating edge. Because power, when confronted by equal or greater confidence, doesn't always prevail through volume. Instead, it is measured by the steadiness with which one stands their ground. Jaishankar and India's leadership did not respond with anger or submission. They responded with composure. And that composure revealed something critical. When a nation knows its own worth, the loudest rhetoric cannot shake it. This encounter was not simply about the clash between Trump's style and India's diplomacy. It was about the meeting of two fundamentally different approaches to power. Trump's rhetoric was built on confrontation, designed to unsettle and dominate through spectacle. India's response, however, was built on principle and confidence, rooted in the clarity of self-respect. Instead of playing the role of the reactive subordinate, India positioned itself as an equal. The subtext was unmistakable. You may speak loudly, but we will not bend. Your words do not define us. Our history, our achievements, and our future define us. That shift is profound because it denies the West, and Trump in particular, the ability to dictate the emotional tone of the exchange. In diplomacy, tone often matters as much as content. Trump's tone sought to establish a hierarchy. America speaks, others listen. Jaishankar'S tone disrupted that hierarchy entirely. His words conveyed, without aggression, that India's place in the world is no longer to be instructed, but to be engaged. That disruption was shocking to many in the West, precisely because they were accustomed to India being deferential. The contrast between Trump's bombast and India's calm assertion exposed a new reality. America's dominance in rhetoric could no longer guarantee dominance in influence. The deeper significance here lies in what this means for global perception. Nations around the world saw this clash and recognized something bigger than a diplomatic exchange. They saw India demonstrating that a nation can withstand the weight of American rhetoric without retreating, without apology, and without hostility. It set an example of how self-confidence, when rooted in history and strength, can neutralize even the most forceful attempts at intimidation. This is why the West felt unsettled, not because India was aggressive, but because it was unshaken. Trump's rhetoric meeting India's confidence also revealed a broader truth about the 21st century. The age of unilateral dominance is fading. In its place is a multipolar world where confidence and self-respect matter as much as military or economic strength. India is showing that nations no longer need to cower before the so-called great powers. They can stand tall, speak firmly, and command respect on their own terms. And in doing so, they change the very rules of engagement. So, when Trump's words hit India, they didn't break it, they didn't bend it. They bounced back. And in that moment, it wasn't Trump setting the stage, it was India. That is what true confidence looks like, the ability to face power without fear, and in doing so, redefine what power actually means. Alter the architecture of global power itself. A civilizational voice challenges Western dominance, and this is one of the most profound shifts happening in our time. For centuries, the global stage has been framed through a Western lens. The West not only commanded military and economic power, but it also monopolized the very language of legitimacy. Words like progress, freedom, and democracy were framed as Western exports, as though no other civilization had ever contemplated them in its own unique way. But when India, through voices like Jaishankar'S, speaks on the world stage, it does so not merely as a modern nation-state, but as a civilization, one that has existed for thousands of years, endured invasions, colonization, and exploitation, yet still retained its core identity. And when such a voice asserts itself, it challenges the very foundation of Western dominance, the assumption that only the West has the authority to define what is legitimate. This is what unsettles the West more than anything else. Because Western dominance has always relied on a certain cultural arrogance, the belief that history begins with them, that progress can only flow from them, and that the rest of the world must learn from their example. But India's civilizational voice disrupts this narrative. India says we are not new to the world. We are not beginners in the project of civilization. We are, in fact, one of the oldest, most enduring civilizations in human history. We don't need to be taught how to value freedom, how to build community, or how to sustain democracy. We have our own traditions, our own philosophies, our own path. This assertion shakes the very pedestal upon which Western dominance has stood, and it is not just rhetoric. India's civilizational voice draws strength from reality. It points to India's democratic resilience, where over 1 billion people exercise their right to vote. It points to India's economic rise, where innovation and growth are redefining the global market. It points to India's spiritual and philosophical traditions, which continue to inspire people worldwide. By speaking from this vantage point, India is not merely participating in the conversation, it is redefining the terms of the conversation. And that is precisely what challenges dominance, the refusal to accept borrowed narratives and the insistence on speaking from one's own deep-rooted identity. For the West, this is disorienting. It is easier to dismiss a country when it speaks only in the language the West provides. But when a nation speaks in its own civilizational voice, unapologetically and authentically, it becomes far more difficult to silence. India is not asking for validation. It is reminding the world that it never lost its legitimacy to begin with. This is what transforms the interaction between India and the West from a dialogue of power into a dialogue of identity. Ultimately, a civilizational voice is harder to dominate because it doesn't rest on transient strengths like GDP figures or military hardware alone. It rests on something deeper: heritage, resilience, and continuity. That is why when India speaks now, the West listens differently. It is not just hearing another country, it is hearing a civilization reclaim its place. And in that sound, Western dominance begins to tremble. From follower to leader, this is the trajectory India is now carving for itself on the global stage, and it marks one of the most dramatic transformations in recent history. For much of the 20th century, India was positioned as a country struggling to find its footing, often portrayed as dependent on foreign aid, guidance, and approval from Western capitals. In the global imagination, India was expected to follow Western models of development, to follow Western prescriptions on governance, and to follow Western instructions in diplomacy. But what we are witnessing today is the collapse of that expectation. India is no longer content to occupy the seat of the student. It has moved to the head of the table, not by aggression but by steady, undeniable assertion of its own capacity. This shift is not accidental. It is the product of decades of perseverance, of learning without submission, and of building without abandoning identity. When India was dismissed as a poor nation, it worked quietly to lift millions out of poverty. When it was underestimated as chaotic, it proved the resilience of the world's largest democracy. When it was patronized as technologically backward, it became a global leader in information technology, space exploration, and innovation. Piece by piece, India accumulated credibility until the world could no longer ignore its presence. The follower narrative cracked, and in its place emerged the reality of a leader, confident, capable, and unafraid to speak in its own voice. Leadership, however, is not only about achievements. It is about the willingness to set the agenda, and this is what India is now doing. In multilateral forums, India is not simply reacting to Western proposals. It is presenting alternatives. It is championing causes like climate justice, where it argues that developed nations must bear a greater responsibility for emissions. It is shaping the discourse on technology, insisting that innovation must serve humanity rather than deepen inequality. It is redefining development itself by demonstrating that economic growth and cultural continuity can coexist. These contributions are not those of a follower. They are those of a leader who offers a vision to the world. What makes this transformation so significant is the manner in which it challenges the global hierarchy. The West has long assumed leadership as its natural right, yet leadership is not inherited, it is earned. India's rise demonstrates that leadership belongs to those who can inspire, who can balance strength with wisdom, and who can offer solutions that resonate across borders. The fact that India does so while rooted in its own civilizational identity makes the challenge even sharper. It proves that leadership does not require imitation of the West, but can emerge authentically from elsewhere. For the West, this change is unsettling because it forces a recalibration of power. The old structure, where the West led and others followed, is eroding. In its place stands a multipolar world, where India is not a supporting character, but a central protagonist. This is what it means for India to move from follower to leader. It is not only about recognition, but about reshaping the very script of global order. And once a nation has claimed that role, there is no going back. The West is shocked by India's assertive diplomacy, and the shock is not simply about what was said, but about what it represents. For decades, Western nations have operated under the assumption that their words carry unquestionable authority, that their criticisms or lectures would automatically place other nations on the defensive. But when India, through Jaishankar'S calm but unyielding tone, rejected this framework, It disrupted an expectation that has been deeply ingrained in the psychology of international politics. The West was not prepared to hear such unapologetic clarity from India, because in their minds India was still supposed to be a recipient of advice, not a challenger of authority. This mismatch between expectation and reality is what caused the shock. Assertive diplomacy is not about shouting louder or striking a confrontational posture. It is about refusing to accept imbalance in dialogue. India's diplomatic stance is assertive precisely because it is measured, consistent, and delivered with self-confidence. Jaishankar does not rage or bluster. He speaks in a manner that leaves no doubt about where India stands. That composure is more unsettling than aggression, because it reveals that India is not intimidated. For the West, this is disarming because their usual tools, criticism, moral pressure, or veiled threats, suddenly lose effectiveness against a nation that stands its ground without flinching. The shock also stems from the realization that India is no longer isolated in its stance. Other nations are watching, and many resonate with the example India sets. Countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America regions that have historically been at the receiving end of Western patronage see in India a model of how to push back with dignity. The West recognizes this ripple effect, and it unnerves them. If India can assert itself successfully, then what prevents others from doing the same? The very foundations of Western dominance rely on maintaining a narrative of superiority. If that crumbles, so too does their leverage. Another dimension of the shock lies in timing. The 21st century is not the 20th century. The West is facing internal challenges, economic strain, political polarization, and questions about its moral authority. To see India rise with confidence at this moment highlights a stark contrast. While Western nations appear divided and uncertain, India projects stability and purpose. That reversal of roles intensifies the discomfort because it forces the West to confront its declining ability to dictate global affairs without challenge. At its core, the West's shock reveals a deeper truth. They underestimated India. They assumed that India's rise would still be filtered through Western approval, that success would come with deference. Instead, India's rise has come with independence of thought and boldness of expression. Jaishankar's words symbolize this independence, and the West's surprise is simply the recognition that the world they thought they controlled is no longer theirs alone. In the long run, this shock will have consequences. It will compel the West to adjust, to listen more carefully, and to recognize that the global stage has changed. India's assertive diplomacy has redrawn the boundaries of engagement, and the West's reaction is proof of just how unexpected and irreversible that change truly is.